Very nice work. Obviously, your work is focused on the tropics, and that's great because it's so needed there. But I suspect a lot of us are probably intrigued by what kind of cropping systems you would recommend that would work, let's say in the northern US or similar climate, Canada.
Yeah. Basically, I'm not the person to ask that question because like you say, my experience has been totally with smallholder farmers in the tropics. In fact, when I was going to a graduate school to get my degree in international ag development, I purposely never took a course in how to drive a tractor because if somebody has a tractor, they don't need me. I wanted to make sure I kept working with the smallholder farmers, and that's why you've never heard me talk about the Middle East, because by and large, in the Middle East, the smallholder farmers don't exist, or at least very much. So I've been asked to go work there and had to turn people down because I don't know about tractor agriculture. So what I can do is recommend that you get to know or look at a lot of the videos that he has on the internet. A fellow by the name of Gabe Brown, if you haven't already heard of him. He farms in North Dakota, which completely blew me away because I didn't think green manure cover crops would work up there. But anyway, he's from North Dakota. He's been farming for 15 years without using fertilizer. And one of his favorite sentences is, well, I only get about average yields here in North Dakota, but there's nobody I know that has the net income that I have. In other words, because my expenses are so much less than everybody else's, that even though I'm only getting about average yields, there's nobody that has the same net profit that I do.
But
so
his
anyway,
land
Gabe
is
Brown, G-A-B-E and then B-R-O-W-N, and he's really become sort of the guru of what are called cover crops in the United States, and it's a movement that's expanding very, very rapidly.
And there's some good resources here. It sounds like you're in the Northeast. I'm not sure. Not sure where in the Northeast, but I'm in Maine, and the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, MAFGA. They have some really great workshops around a lot of topics, including cover crops and green manures. Okay. Their Common Ground Country Fair, I think it's third weekend in September, has a lot of workshops, including ones on green manures. And as I recall, I'm in the same boat with Roland, working in the tropics, but I recall them talking about a number of different cover crops that they use here: winter rye, oats, clover, alfalfa, some others too that I'm blanking on at the moment.
Yeah, there's some others too. Yeah. The other thing you can look at the Brazilians. There's one group called Ipagre. There's another group called Soyapar. They are in the Brazilian states of Paraná and Santa Catarina, and they've been working with large-scale farmers as well as small-scale farmers, and they're far enough south so they get they have winter crops, and they use all of those that you mentioned plus quite a number of others. So you could go to Google them, and or even just probably if you just Googled conservation agriculture in Brazil, you'd get a lot of their stuff, and they have lots and lots of written manuals and stuff like that on how to use green manure cover crops and cold weather, how large scale farmers can use cold weather green manure cover crops. Oh, they use a whole series of they use about 60 species just in Brazil, but most of them are for the warm tropics. But yeah, all in the colder areas they use all the ones you used. That you mentioned. They also use things like sunflower. One of their favorites is for breaking up the hard pans and clay pans under the soil. It's a type of turnip or radish. It's called radish in Spanish, but it's called turnip in English, I think. But it's a I think it's called a forage turnip in English. But anyway, and that's a case also of they also use quite a number of green manure cover crops that are not leguminous because they're trying to do other things with the soil too.
There's also NOFA in the Northeast Organic Farmers Association. I believe they have branches in most of the states in the Northeast.
Okay.
I don't know them as well, but imagine they offer similar resources.
Yeah.
As
no, I think we're going to hear more and more about cover crops because people are realizing how incredible they can be. And, you know, I think more and more organic groups and so forth and so on, like Rodale started working with green manure cover crops like 10 or 15 years ago in Pennsylvania. And you know, we're going to see more and more of it because farmers are realizing that their soils have been tremendously damaged by the fact that all they've been depending on for fertility was chemical fertilizers. I'm not saying that the chemical fertilizers are damaging their soils, although
I would say they are.
well, they acidify the soil, and smallholder farmers can't afford to buy lime, so it's a real danger for small scale farmers if their soil's already fairly acid to be using chemical fertilizers because they basically ruin their soils. They can't use them anymore after a while. Well, it takes, depending on how bad they start, it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but they can ruin their soils.
Yeah, I believe they do a lot of damage to the ecosystems in the soil.
Well, that's true. They kill a lot of the microorganisms that we're finding have so many incredibly useful. You know, we're just beginning to scratch the surface in terms of what happens with microbiology in the soil. But as we learn more, there's going to be more and more reasons why we shouldn't use chemical fertilizer. Yeah, that's very clear.
Agreed.
Were you talking about David Johnson's work at one point?
David Johnson is the fellow whose quantitative analysis of the amount of long-term carbon is sequestered in the soil by different systems. It's his numbers that I use. Now, by most scientists, I would say, he's considered to be sort of an outlier on the side of, you know, saying there's more carbon being sequestered. But the more and more scientists actually study this in a fair way, the more they're finding out that in fact they were wrong and he's right. And whoops. And just a minute here. No, something's happened. Oh, here. Okay. Are you still there?
Yep.
Okay.
You're still with us.
Okay. Like for instance, this research that I mentioned from southern Malawi with using Gliricidia, that, like I say, has numbers that are about double mine and double what David Johnson would have come up with. So I think the truth is going to be I think the truth is going to be more of an outlier even than David Johnson is.
So he'll be normal.
Someday I think we're going to consider him conservative.
Roland, I'm seeing some people are asking questions in the chat, and Eric asked, are all your farmers accepting of green manure cover crops, or do you run into resistance for any reasons?
Well, it's interesting. Probably the most resistance we've had is in Central America, where I worked for many years, and that's because we've started teaching green manures before we knew enough about them. And so some of the systems we taught there really weren't that good. So yes, there is some resistance. Now in Africa, it's amazing. You know, agronomists in Africa, African agronomists will tell you that villager farmers don't ever want to change, which historically is totally the opposite from the truth. Almost everything they grow now came from either India or Latin America. You know, maize, cassava, sorghum, they're all crops that African farmers adopted spread clear across the continent by themselves before there were extension programs of any kind. But nevertheless, the African farmers are much more interested in these right now, because what's happened is, as the droughts have gotten worse, and they will continue to get worse, the farmers have finally given up on the idea that, well, maybe this is a low point in some sort of a curve that's going to right itself after a while. In other words, they're realizing that these droughts are just going to keep on getting worse and worse and worse. And this last 2 years had some of the worst droughts of all of in memory. And so what's happened is African farmers, a lot of them in the drought-prone areas of Africa, which is nowadays close to half the continent, they're realizing that in a few years, their whole way of life, a few years meaning somewhere between 5 and 10 years probably, their whole way of life in the rural areas is going to be kaput. It's going to be over. It's going to be finished. They're going to have to either die of starvation or go to the cities and try and find work in the slums, which is not easy. You know, I mean, they realize the writing's on the wall, and their willingness to try something like this, once you've explained it for a few minutes, is just incredible. It's phenomenal. I've never worked with farmers in Latin America or Asia that were as open to change and wanting to try out something new as farmers in Africa, because they realize pretty soon the game's going to be up.
I could add from current work in Central America with the cover crops, some of the resistance that we've come up against has to do with concerns about cover crops bringing in some pests like slugs, and in some cases making it impossible to see the poisonous snakes that are in the area. And then also just the work of controlling some of the cover crops that we have worked with tend to spread very quickly and sort of take over if you don't manage them properly. So we've obviously been working to find ways to address all of those issues, and it speaks to the importance of adequate training to use these techniques well. And it also ties in with a question Carol asked about compost. She said that she totally understands the preference for cover crops and green manures, but was wondering where compost could fit in, particularly, I guess, in places like Massachusetts where they have food waste bans. And I could say that, at least in my experience and the farmers in our programs, compost works very well for the gardens, the dooryard gardens, where it's a relatively small area of intensive production. And the farmers in our program have produced pretty significant amounts of compost to cover a good-sized area, but not the same as what you would get with the cover crops.
Yeah.
and green.
Well, I mentioned that earlier, and yes, I did say that, like kitchen gardens, even sometimes high-value fruits and vegetables on a little larger scale, in those cases, because they're high value, you're working with high value crops there, then they will pay for all the labor you put into the compost. And also, especially with vegetables, the quality of the vegetables will depend heavily on the quality of the soil, and the quality of the vegetables when you take them to market will definitely have a major influence on the price. So that you also have by using compost, you'll get even better prices in the markets. So yeah, I agree. And the other thing with especially with intensive vegetable gardens and multi-crop, biodiverse gardens, it's very hard to fit green manures in there because your land is very, very worthwhile, very expensive, your land space, especially if it's irrigated. And so the space that the green manure cover crops are going to take up in your fields becomes very expensive. So yeah, there are places for I would never tell a farmer not to use compost, but I would tell them it's probably that using it on their corn or their sorghum or their cassava is probably not the best place to use it.
And I'll mention one other niche.
Now, the first part of your question was, you asked another question at the beginning. What was it?
No, I think I was just sort of continuing on
Central America. Yeah, I think basically I would recommend you get my book called Restoring the Soil, because it talks about, and get the second edition. The first edition was not nearly as good. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years since the first edition came out. But it will talk about it spends the whole last half of the book talking about, okay, which plants can be used in which ways, in which situations. And for instance, the problem of green manure sort of taking over your maize field or something like that, they're probably using mucuna, and we don't even use mucuna in maize much anymore. There are too many other things that are much better, like the lab bean. If you're using mucuna in a maize field, find an alternative, because people are wasting their time pruning it, and they're not getting any food out of it. If the soil's too bad for food, then have them get a bushy jack bean seed. The bushy jack bean won't climb up and compete with their maize. And then after 2 years, switch to lab and teach them how to eat it, how to eat the lab. The only place we use mucuna anymore is for regenerating wastelands where people can't grow crops anymore at all. And then it can be useful, because it's very, very good at controlling weeds, because it is so aggressive. But intercropped with people's crops, we don't use mucuna anymore.
Going back to the compost question, I'll just mention one other sort of niche compost that we work with, which is composting latrines, where a lot of the families in our program either don't have latrines, which is obviously a health issue, or they have ones that they dig by hand, and that's obviously very labor intensive if you have to dig a new one by hand every time one gets filled up. So we help them to set up composting latrines where the material can be taken out and composted and used primarily with tree crops for an added layer of safety in using that.
Yeah, well, we worked with composting latrines in Honduras for probably 10, 15 years back in the 80s. And I haven't been back to check and see how many of them have been sustainable, but I think as far as I can see, it was a very good technology that should be sustainable.
And Roland, somebody had a question about Mozambique and whether there's anybody doing this kind of work there. Do you know?
There was, and that person was myself. I worked in the Inhambane area on the southern coast, and then up in out on the coast from Nampula in the north. And in both cases, the farmers were just absolutely thrilled, because what's happened the reason I know what's going to happen in the rest of Africa is because on the coast of Mozambique, they have heavier population pressure on the land than they do in most of Africa. And so they had to quit fallowing, or doing slash and burn agriculture, if you want to call it that. They had to stop doing fallowing 20 years before the rest of Africa. See, what's ignited this whole process of destroying the soils is the fact that population pressure has gotten to the point where people couldn't fallow for 15 years anymore. So they did it for 10, then they did it for 8, then they did it for 4, and now fallowing is basically on its deathbed. And that's why the organic matter content of the soil is falling through the floor. But in Mozambique, that started 20 years earlier, which means they can't grow maize anymore. They can't grow millet, at least in northern and southern Mozambique. Now in the center they can, because the Zambezi River continues to bring lots of silt. But in the north and the south, they can't grow maize, they can't grow sorghum, they can't grow millet. They're living on cassava roots, which have virtually no nutritional value at all outside of a little bit of calories. And the child stunting rate in Mozambique is somewhere above, in the rural areas, is somewhere above 70%, which puts us among the 3 worst countries in the entire world.
But
that's where the rest of Africa is headed if we don't do something.
Yeah,
they were thrilled that within 2 years of growing jack bean, intercropped with their cassava, so they didn't even have to, lose any of their cassava land. They'd intercrop the jack bean. In 2 years, they were able to grow maize again. They were just absolutely thrilled.
I need to ask a follow-up question, please, because I'm the person who asked that question. So you're not there, so who is there doing work now?
Well, the organization I was working with had a change of personnel, and they quit working with green manures. But I'm sure the people in the villages where we worked are continuing to do it. And I can, if you really, do you work in Mozambique? Is that it?
No, but I have a colleague in Mozambique who is very interested in trying to extend agriculture in an ecological way.
Okay, and where is that person working?
She's in Beira right now.
Oh, okay. Well, Beira's soils are better off because that's in the center of the country, I think, if where the Zambezi River is. But what I can do, send me an email,
Okay.
and I will connect you with the fellow who was the head of the program when I was there doing green manures. He's still working with another organization in Tet, which is in Mozambique, and
Okay.
he could help this person make contacts.
could you
Neither of the
type out
areas
your
I work in
email
are very
address,
close
please?
to Beira, so you know they would have to travel a ways to see the work, but it would be well worthwhile.
Right.
So
Could you type out your email address?
and this is for anybody that wants to use it, is rbunchw, rbunchw @gmail.com.
Thank you.
Don't forget the W.
Charlie had a question. He says, since you're studying polycultures, how do the Mesoamerican farmers harvest a single crop without disturbing the other crops? And I'll let Roland go into it more, but I can give one very simple answer. In the case of our farmers, they're harvesting by hand. And so they can be very selective about exactly what they're harvesting at any time. The farms in our program, usually when they join our program, they are growing 3 or 4 crops. And by the time they graduate from our program a few years later, they're growing 20, 30, or 40 different crops.
Oh my gosh, that's great. Yeah, basically, yeah, I would have to refer you to people in the United States that are already doing this, and Gabe Brown would be a very good one. He uses 10 to 12 green manures, and what he does is they're winter crops, and so he doesn't have his other crops there except maybe wheat. And anyway, but he can tell you about that much better than I can. Any other questions?
Or does anybody have any other experiences with cover crops and green manures that they'd like to share with the group?
I just have a question about where I should buy your book, Roland. I don't want to get it from Amazon, so I'm not sure if you have a website that I should buy it from or if you recommend somewhere else.
Okay, well, the group that published it and that sells it mostly is Echo in Florida, ECHO. They're at www.echocommunity.org, I think. But they right now they aren't selling it because of the pandemic.
Right.
And we're talking about how they can sell it. And I was going to suggest they sell it through Amazon, but obviously for you that's not a possibility either. They have their own store and they were selling it from their store there, but right now they've closed down their store, so we're going to have to see how they can keep up the sales somehow.
All right, thank you. I'll just wait till they open.
Okay.
I have a question about trees.
Yeah.
How do you make a judgment as to what you can grow underneath a tree's canopy and how much of the nutrients are being pulled up by the tree's roots?
Okay. The competition, and I'm not sure why, the competition for nutrients is not that big a problem. I mean, we thought there would be all sorts of problems, but it's really not a big problem. I think the trees get most of their nutrients from down deep in the soil. Where there is a problem is competition for moisture sometimes. The first 2 or 3 years we can have some problems with competition for moisture, but our experience all over Latin America and Africa is that the competition for nutrients is not as bad as what the books would lead you to believe. So anyway, that's part of the answer. Certainly we don't plant the trees that close together. I mean, you know, we usually have a population of well, we plant the trees at the shortest spacing between trees would be about 4.5 yards each way. In other words, the trees are in a pattern like I showed in that last photo, which you may still be looking at. I'm not sure, but we don't plant the trees that close together, and frankly, maybe it's just partly because of the trees we've selected. Maybe the trees we've selected tend to get their nutrients from further down the soil. One thing some people have done, although we haven't found it really necessary, but one thing some people have done is the first, like the second and third year of the tree's growth, they will take a plow and go around each tree and cut off all the roots that are less than, 10 inches below the soil surface. So that way, the tree, like I say, is sort of trained to get its nutrients from deeper in the soil. But we haven't seen that as being a major problem, except, like I say, for moisture. And even the problem with competition of moisture is only for the first 3 or 4 years. After that, the soil is able to hold a lot more moisture, and you don't see that. Of course, another thing that happens is that I think one of the reasons the trees also help with the situation of ending the droughts is that the trees get a lot of their moisture from down deep in the soil, whereas your crops, of course, are getting all their moisture from the top, 25 to 50 inches. And what happens when you have trees is the heat from the sun will stimulate the trees to transpire more water, but your crops will be transpiring a lot less water because they're in the shade. And so both the soil evaporation and the transpiration from the leaves is reduced. And that means that obviously you're going to have a lot more moisture in your soil because your low-lying crops, even maize and so forth, corn, they just aren't transpiring as much water because they're in the shade of the trees. So the amount of water in the root zone of your crops is not wasted on keeping the crops cool. It's used mostly for bringing nutrients into the plant and helping the plant grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay.
Roland, I once heard that with Gliricidius sapium, that if you plant them by stake, they tend to have more spread out root system. And if you plant them by seed, they tend to have a deeper taproot that accesses the nutrients in the water deeper.
That's true, but we do both things with the Gliricidia, and the farmers haven't noticed any difference.
Sorry, say that again?
I say that's true. When you plant it as a cutting, it doesn't have a taproot. It tends to get its nutrients from a little more shallow area in the soil. But still, the roots go down, 3 or 4 meters. And our farmers now, farmers don't detect a 10 or 20% difference, so there could be some difference. I mean, but when we're doubling and tripling yields, the 10% difference doesn't matter that much anyway. So farmers haven't noticed a difference. In fact, they prefer the cuttings if they can get them, because that way your tree basically becomes a tree 6 months to a year sooner than from a small seedling. And actually, what we do in droughty areas, the reason I say small seedling, in droughty areas, if we're going to be using seedlings, we will plant our nurseries about a month earlier than most people would, because we want the trees to be at least a yard tall when we plant them, which is much larger than you would ever do it in the States, I think. And we do that because that way they have their roots are deeper in the soil. You have to dig a bigger hole, but we don't bother using animal manure or compost or anything like that. We just plant the trees. These trees are so adapted to poor soils. We just plant them in lousy, rotten soils, and they grow very well. But if you have a cutting that's about 1.5 meters long, so 0.5 meter goes in the soil and 1 meter is outside of the soil, you're gonna have a tree 6 months to a year, a large tree 6 months to a year sooner than with the seedlings. So that's what we advise farmers to do, and they've tried out different sizes, and they agree that basically you want to use long cuttings if you can.
Roland, after that very specific technical question, I wonder if I can zoom out a lot now and ask
Fine.
for your opinion on the global perspective on all of this. I believe that the world's governments, if I recall, spend about $60 billion a year on agricultural subsidies, mostly for agrochemicals, and that type of farming. And I'm just wondering if that $60 billion or some portion of it was redirected towards helping farmers transition to using cover crops and green manures. Do you have a sense of just how far that would go? How much do you think it will take to transition, particularly the smallholder farmers?
You said 30 billion?
What's that?
How much money did you say? 30 billion?
60 billion a year, I believe, is what the world's
50 billion a year.
60 billion.
Okay, we're introducing these crops to smallholder farmers at a total cost of about $300 per farmer, and I think it'll be a lot lower than that eventually, because we're just getting started. But so
it would go a long way.
50 billion, that's a sixth of a. Let's see, 300 into 50. You said 50 billion, right?
60 billion.
300 into that would be somewhere around $100 million. That would be 100 million farmers. We could reach 100 million farmers a year on that once we've scaled up a little bit. We couldn't do it right now, but within 5 years we plan to be doing that, and
you wouldn't have to keep
about 100.
And you wouldn't have to keep spending the money like they do.
We could reach. Excuse me. For $50 billion, we could reach 100 million new farmers. That means,
and you wouldn't have to keep giving them chemicals every year, like.
Wouldn't have to give them chemicals, and we also are totally against giving them. See, one of the things with the whole sequestering carbon movement is they're paying, a lot of cases they're paying farmers for sequestering carbon. I'm totally against that. My experience with farmers all over the world is you pay them to do something, and the minute you stop paying them, they'll stop doing it. Which means you're spending an awful lot of money to keep something going that the advantages that farmers get from growing these green manures, as I've described in the last hour, are so incredible. They're so significant that there's absolutely no reason. You're not going to speed up the process by paying people if you're doing it right. If you're doing it right, the process will be just as fast as if you tried to pay them. In fact, the whole thing of paying them is just one more unnecessary activity that costs you money. You know, and we that's not necessary. We have a goal. The organization I set up a year ago, we have a goal of and this is going to sound strange, but if we can tap into even a large, a decent percentage of that money, that's and we expect we're going to have to get most of it from Europe, but I think in the long run we're not going to get our money from people in the United States or from development people. We're going to get it from environmentalists in Europe, because they are putting together billions of dollars to sequester carbon. And once we can prove that we can sequester carbon for about as low, for probably less money than anybody else on Earth, I think we're going to be getting a lot of money from those folks. And our goal over 25 years is to end hunger among 70% of the smallholder farmers in all of sub-Saharan Africa.
Roland, I think Rachel had her hand raised.
Okay.
You have to unmute. You have to unmute, Rachel.
You unmuted and then you muted again. We can't hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just barely. Speak up.
Oh, my focus is actually on the little town of South Portland to try and get this town greener. So it doesn't really follow within what you're doing. And I'm very impressed with what you're doing in Africa.
Thank you. So you're talking about Portland, Maine, right?
What was the question?
You're talking about Portland, Maine?
Yes, South Portland, Maine, yes.
Oh,
Can you
okay.
tell us what you're doing
Yeah,
there?
well, once again, I would refer you to the different people that the different organizations that people have mentioned, in the last 15 minutes,
Yeah, like
as well
MAFTA.
as Gabe Brown, and work with those people
Right.
because they can give
Right.
you a lot of very good advice.
Rachel, what are you doing in South Portland?
Well, what we have done is stop tar sands from getting exported from here,
Great.
from Alberta, and I'll be talking about that next Saturday. And otherwise, we figured out how we could get the city council to move. So we've become very familiar with them, and we've stopped the use of synthetic fertilizer and pesticides in
Excellent.
the city.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Roland, I'd like to ask about the $300 per farmer,
Yeah.
and about, how does that break down into, I don't know, seeds or staff work or whatever? And also ask, how many smallholder farmers are there in the world?
Yeah, I don't have that number right on the tips of my fingers, but I
500
certainly
million.
have dealt with it when I was calculating, how much of the carbon we could sequester that the Paris Accords want us to sequester and stuff. The first part of your question was, oh yeah, the $300. That's an estimate from what it cost us to triple the agricultural production of smallholder farmers in Central America. It cost us about $300 a farmer to permanently triple their basic grain production. And in that case, we also helped them grow vegetables. So I think we're going to be able to do it for a lot less than that. I would guess, well, right now in Malawi, we're doing it for less than $100 a farmer. And most programs are not going to be that efficient because that's got some special characteristics that make it more efficient than most will be. But probably that breaks down into, and that's total cost. That's even dividing up the administration costs and so forth. So probably that would be, a third of that would be administrative costs because agronomists earn so much more money than I mean, the technology itself is so cheap that we do have fairly high administrative costs. Then about 30% would be transportation, and another 30% would be the actual doing the training and getting seed and all that sort of stuff. That's about the way it breaks down. That's a very rough amount. And like I say, well, one of the things that's happening in Malawi is that the people are so excited about this whole thing that we have dozens, literally dozens and dozens of smallholder farmers that are teaching other farmers. In other words, the multiplier effect has been absolutely incredible. So like for $4,000 this last year, we had something like 20,000 new farmers planting Glycosidium. I mean, it's the cost is going to be way lower than what I just, than $300 a farmer. But I'm saying that for now because I don't want to give a figure we don't have strong evidence for.
And Clarice, there are about 500 million smallholder farmers in the world right now. I believe about 20% of them currently use regenerative practices such as the green manures and cover crops. Those 500 million smallholders produce about 70% of, or they feed about 70% of the world's population. But despite that fact, the majority of people going hungry in the world are in these rural communities, and many of them are smallholder farmers themselves because they don't have access to training in adequate farming practices to feed themselves and their communities well. So there's tremendous opportunity in the smallholder farmers of the world.
And that means that $50 billion figure, if I've got my arithmetic correct, and I won't guarantee it because I'm doing it all in my head, but with 3 years at $50 billion, we could cover the whole world. The smallholder farmers of the whole world, if those figures are accurate. I mean, we're not talking about money that the world couldn't spend on this.
And the 20, did you say 20% of them are already doing what I would think of as regenerative or whatever other word you want?
I believe that's the figure that I've seen, yes.
That is so encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of these are people that are still using traditional agriculture, so they aren't using pesticides, they aren't using chemicals, and so forth and so on. At least that's what I would understand.
I think that's probably true.
Jules Pretty from Essex University.
Yep.
Did a huge study. I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. He even presented it to and invited me to come and be there to Prince Charles, and his study showed that there were millions and millions and millions of farmers around the world that were farming in a non-chemical way.
So that 20% is regenerative farming in general, or is it specific to what you're talking about? The
regenerative in general.
Green manures? Oh no, most of those farmers weren't doing green manures. They were doing other things.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that 20% is not yet doing green manure.
No, not the full.
No, my estimate, and this is probably a very conservative figure, just from what I've seen around the world and a few people that have told me about other systems I haven't seen. There are somewhere around 25 to 30 million people using green manure cover crops. Families, that are using green manure cover crops. So that would cover
out of 500 million smallholders.
Approximately 5 times that many people.
So
But,
25 to 30 million small farmers?
Smallholder farmers are using green
wow.
manure cover crops as we speak.
Wow.
Roland, we can hear you fine, but all we can see is your forehead.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Is that better?
That's much better.
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me.
Roland, I had a,
sit back a little bit further if you can.
yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
Roland, this is Charlie again. I work for a concern in Silver Spring, Maryland called Trees for the Future. I don't know if you've heard of them or not.
Say the name again.
Trees for the Future?
I worked for them.
You work for them?
Long time ago.
You know John Leary then, right? You know him.
This was in the 90s.
Oh, okay. In any event, they do a lot of work in Africa primarily. And they have a system whereby they, and I can't remember the specifics, but they use hedges and small trees to block the grazing animals from the crops. Now, is that the type of system that you've seen?
Well, I don't think I've seen it. Maybe I saw it and didn't realize what I was looking at. But I would very much recommend they look at this monkey thorn tree because I've worked with farmers in more than 20 countries in Africa, and I've been watching for good fences for probably 20 years, and there's nothing that comes close to this monkey thorn in terms of the effectiveness of it. Why didn't you tell them about it? And if they want to see it, I'll show it to them in Malawi or one of the South African countries.
Okay, thank you.
Roland,
Yeah.
Sharon speaking, I have a question. What are the barriers to bringing what you are teaching in Africa to scale for larger farmers? And I realize the emphasis is on the smallholders because you can achieve so much with them, and it's so beneficial to those people in many, many ways. But if we were to meet the goals that you cited as far as the Paris Climate Accord goals, that will still fall short in terms of getting beyond the Climate Accord, because ideally we want to even try to get beyond what the Climate Accord is in terms of carbon drawdown. So is it even worth going the path of trying to get the larger scale farmers to do this kind of thing? And if it is something that can be done, what are the barriers to that?
Okay, first of all, yes, it definitely is going to be needed. And my over 75% figure the percentage of the carbon that needs to be sequestered according to the Paris Accords, that included largeholder farmers. We will need largeholder farmers because smallholder farmers only own something like 12% of the agricultural land in the world. So they aren't going to, the smallholder farmers by themselves are only going to maybe reach 6 or 7% of that whole. Now, what are the changes that would be needed to get large scale farmers to do it? In the tropics, they could do it much more like what we do with smallholder farmers, because see, there are a couple of things that happen in the temperate countries that make it much more difficult for green manure cover crops. One is you've got tractors and all that sort of thing that if they run through a field, they're going to kill half your green manure cover crops. You smash them, These green manure cover crops are adapted when they're intercropped. They often need to be harvested by hand. They need to be, we use handwork or animal traction. So what we've done is adapted to having those ways of tilling the soil or of whatever you're going to do. If you're using tractors, then that's a huge problem for us. The other difference, and some of this is very interesting. You can't intercrop in the States like we can in the tropics. For one reason, we have more sunlight. We just plain have more sunlight. So some of it gets through to the shorter crops. The other reason, which I've never seen written in any book, but it just totally stands to reason and is totally logical, and I would defend it totally against anybody who disagrees, and that is the tropics by definition. In the tropics by definition are the area of the world where the sun is straight overhead at least once a year, okay, and usually twice. Okay, that means that the sunlight is coming in at a much more vertical angle, much more perpendicular to the land surface, which means that if you've got a small crop standing next to a maize plant, if the sun is coming in vertically, the short crop has a good chance of getting some sunlight. If it's coming in at an angle like it does in the temperate countries, your maize is going to totally shade the shorter crop. Do you get what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So we can intercrop, and that means that is a huge advantage. We very rarely rotate our green manures with our crops, because that means you can only grow your crop half the time. And our farmers need to grow it all the time if they're going to have enough food. So by intercropping, we can let them grow their maize every single year, but we have 2 or 3 other plants in there that are going to create biodiversity and help reduce the insect attacks on the maize, and at the same time produce food and better soils and resistance to the whole shooting match. So we can intercrop much more easily and much more effectively and much more productively in the tropics. So that helps us. Now, if I were working with large-scale farmers here in the tropics, I wouldn't intercrop. I would have to suggest that they rotate. But for large-scale farmers, that's not such a big problem because they aren't so limited by the amount of land they have. And but we would use many of the same species, as do the Brazilians. The Brazilians who do work with large-scale farmers, I mean, they have some farmers that have over 250,000 acres, and those people are also growing green manure cover crops and have found very useful and reduces their costs tremendously. So there are ways of doing it, and we do need to reach large-scale farmers if we're going to have much impact.
And Sharon, if I could
Here in the temperate zone in the United States, what possibility is there with any of the larger scale?
Well, instead of intercropping, you would rotate. You would rotate crops. In other words, you would grow the green manure certain parts. Well, what Gabe Brown does basically is he grows as I understand it, he grows the green manure cover crops in the winter when his crops won't grow anyway because of the snow and stuff like that. And then in the warmer months, he grows his crops, usually monocropped.
Mm-hmm.
And Sharon, I think there is a tremendous potential with the smallholder farmers. I agree, though, the large scale farmers, we need to help them to make the transition as well. But the 500 million smallholder farmers in the world, if they transition to a variety of regenerative practices, including cover crops and green manures and agroforestry and other regenerative practices, excuse me, they could draw down 16 million tons of carbon out of the atmosphere back into the soils every year up to a certain point when the soils reach their capacity. And that would be enough to bring the atmospheric carbon back to pre-industrial levels and would buy us time to then do what we need to do as far as bringing the emissions down. There's a movement that's focused on this, an initiative focused on this called the 4 per 1,000 initiative. It was started by the French government and a number of other governments and organizations.
Yes, I'm familiar with that. So that's what you're talking about?
Yes, yeah, I'm
and-
talking about the 4 per 1,000 idea, right?
And how many tons did you say? 16?
16 million tons per year.
And bringing it to pre-industrial levels, you mean setting us on the path, or do you have a certain time frame?
It would bring us back to pre-industrial levels by, is it 2024? Is that the 4 per 1,000? I'm basing that off the 4 per 1,000 numbers.
That sounds high to me. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a little high, but anyway, we can
No. What I recall is
send
that
me an email and we'll do some arithmetic together.
that 4 per 1,000, as I recall, was that it would allow us to capture the remaining emissions that we're not going to get out of the Paris Agreement. So we're only going to get so far with reducing emissions, but if we wanted to go farther, that's where the 4 per 1,000 was going to do. So it essentially captures remaining emissions that we should be reducing altogether by renewable energies, energy efficiency, et cetera. So there's this extra amount that we can't eliminate, or we can't reduce going up into the atmosphere. So that's where the agriculture captures that balance in the 4 per 1,000 plan. So
Okay.
that's not, that still doesn't get us to a net drawdown to pull down more from the atmosphere, as I understand it. That's another amount that we have to get at. And so certainly the smallholder work that you're doing is going to contribute to that, but I wondered if we still needed to try to work with some of the larger farmers to get even more drawdown.
Absolutely.
Certainly.
And by the way, I would guess that even Gabe Brown and so forth are not going to be able to sequester as much carbon long-term as our African farmers can per acre because of the factors I mentioned. But the ranchers, the large-scale ranchers in the north, can probably sequester twice as much as what we're doing. So the average, I mean, I think on average, the farmers and ranchers, the large-scale farmers and ranchers can easily do as well as our farmers are doing in Africa. So I did want to mention that. I'm not just talking about farmers. The farmers and ranchers of the world could meet that 75 to 85% figure.
Excuse me for a moment. We are officially at the end of the conference day. However, you are all welcome to continue to chat for as long as you like. Just wanted to let you know.
I'm willing to stay on if people still want to ask questions. And also, you know, if people have things they want to contribute, they don't just have to ask questions. They can contribute information that they know. I forget the name, but like somebody just did about the 4 per 1,000.
Sharon, that was
that's
Sharon.
Sharon.
Which was very helpful. And I know that effort. I totally salute the people that are doing that.
Yes, thank you. And the 75 figure you just said was what again? 75%?
Okay. The Paris Accords agreed on a certain amount of carbon that would need to be sucked out of the air and put somewhere. They were talking about caves and all sorts of stuff like that, and shooting particles into the atmosphere to keep to reduce global warming and stuff like that. Anyway, they had a goal for 2,100 of a certain number of megatons of carbon that would be taken out of the atmosphere. Now, scientists are gradually realizing there's quite a bit of work on this now. They're realizing that the easiest and best and cheapest way to do that is by putting it in the soil or by growing forests. Well, the thing is that there's not a, I mean, the amount of land that is still available to grow more forest is much, much less than the amount of land that people are farming on. And unless you're going to start taking land away from farmers, and I would definitely oppose that. So especially the farmers I work with. So, you know, but anyway, they have a goal. I forget what the number is, but they have a goal to reach by the year 2100. And what I'm saying is that smallholder farmers, smallholder and largeholder farmers and ranchers around the world could sequester 85% of all that carbon by themselves, which
smallholder,
which would make,
you said smallholder farmers
a
and
lot of
ranchers?
people, including The Economist magazine, Time magazine, in a recent issue they dedicated totally to climate change, and scientists and so forth and so on are sort of already giving up on ever reaching the Paris Accord agreements. If they only knew what we can do with the soil, I'm sure they would change their minds. There's no reason we can't reach those goals and even surpass them. And I realize that the scientific community is very skeptical about that, but they haven't seen what we're doing, and they don't understand it, and they haven't. In fact, they have all sorts of myths about how it takes 100 years to form. I'm sure some of you've heard this. It takes 100 years to form an inch of topsoil. Well, don't believe it. That's absolute total nonsense. We have farmers in Central America that are increasing their topsoil at the rate of about 1/3 of an inch a year. Okay, I mean, it takes 73 years, not 100 years. So, you know, there's a lot of hogwash out there about you know. Also, some people are saying there's a limit to how much carbon you can sequester in the soil. Well, if there is, it's an interesting fact that you know, thousands of years ago, all the carbon that is now in the atmosphere was in the soil.
Right.
So somehow the soil was able to hold it. Furthermore, if we're able to increase the amount of topsoil that exists on any piece of land so quickly, then there's no limit to the amount of carbon you can sequester, because all that extra soil, all that extra topsoil you're building is storing more and more carbon. So, you know, I mean, there's all sorts of nonsense going around about this stuff. And I mean, I can take you to places in Central America where, according to soil analyses, the topsoil has a 12% organic matter content, which a lot of scientists right there won't believe you. In fact, we got those numbers because there was a Cornell student that was doing his dissertation on this system, and his advisor wouldn't allow him to publish that even though he went to 3 different labs and got the same figure of 12%. And I have since learned from some of the world's top soil scientists in the Netherlands and so forth at ISRIC that in fact 12% is an achievable rate. So 12% organic matter, that's 6% carbon. And these farmers that have been using green manures, they've been using them for about 50 or 60 years now, longer than I was working with them. And they have 30 to 40 inches of topsoil at 12%. Now, there's a lot of carbon in there. And they've done that in 50 to 60 years, because the soil all around them that isn't using the system yet has very, very little organic matter and a very thin layer of topsoil. So, I mean, you know, and scientists, they just, you know, you tell them that and they don't believe you. I have to, you know, I'm going to have to take them down and rub their noses in it and show them that, in fact, that's what's happened.
They still wouldn't believe you. It's outside of their belief system, and believing is seeing. If you don't believe, you don't see.
Well, that's what's happened with green manures in general, but that's changing. I mean, you know, now there are quite a few scientific articles that admit that, in fact, planting legumes among maize and so forth does help increase production. They don't know the half of it yet, but they're getting there.
But as Max Planck said, paradigms change one funeral at a time.
That's right.
I would like to check the
So-
numbers that I wrote down. I think I wrote them down. There are 500 million smallholder farmers. They own 40% of the land, and they produce 70% of the food,
40% of what land?
of the agricultural land on the earth.
Well,
Did-
no, that's not the
somebody
figure.
say that?
Boy, those figures are very different from the ones I've seen.
Okay, so what's the, of these 500 million farmers, did one of you say what percent of the agricultural land they own? Where did I get my,
Roland, you said
Well,
17%?
What I have read is that smallholder farm, now it could be that people are using a different definition for smallholder farmers, because there is not somebody asked me earlier and I gave some figures, but there's not an accepted definition of smallholder farmers. So probably people are using different definitions. But if you're talking about smallholder farmers that have, say, less than 15 acres, or about 5 hectares, then the total number of land that they possess of the world's farmland is about 12%.
12%? Okay. And is the other number that I thought I wrote down, that I thought I heard, they produce 70% of the food that's produced in the world?
I believe the more accurate way to say it would be that they provide food for 70% of the world's population.
Ah, okay.
Which is a little different.
Yeah, right.
Some people eat more food than other people do.
Right.
And also, I wanted to clarify the number, that 75 to 85%, you said that be taken care of of the carbon would be taken care of by smallholder farmers and ranchers, or are you talking about the farmers in general?
If you're talking about 70% of the Paris Accords, I'm talking about large and smallholder farmers.
Large and small, yeah. And what portion of that is this other smallholders going to contribute to?
Well, again, it would be about 12%,
12.
Yeah.
because they have 12% of the land.
Yeah. Where would you find those figures? Where could you find that data?
FAO?
Oh, let's see. Probably the FAO would be the best place.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's where I got my figures.
Okay.
Nancy, I spent some time chasing that down
Uh-huh.
a couple of years ago, and you'll get different opinions from different places. Via Campesina says their 200 million farmers grow 70% of the food. They're talking about
Just 200 million?
Well, that's what they say they're representing, 70%, 200 million farmers. I don't know about the other 300 million. I can't imagine that Via Campesina has everybody under their umbrella. But
no, I can't either.
that's what I've read, and I've read other numbers elsewhere. Honestly, I don't think anybody really knows. But whatever the numbers are, we want to make them bigger. That's all we need to know.
Well, I think it's a very impressive, though, if we could with confidence say, if we could change this a little to say that this, I think it's very, here I'm changing the numbers a little, but a fifth of the agricultural land, which is more than, anyhow, fifth of the land produces food for more than half the population of Earth. I think that would be safe to say, even if different people are saying different things. And I think it's a quite startling figure.
And it could be so much more.
I think a lot of people, and I wish the World Bank would take that to heart, because I understand the World Bank is starting an effort to take communal land away from smallholder farmers. And in Africa, that could be an absolute disaster. It would be bad enough in Latin America, but in Africa, it would be an absolute disaster. And we need to do something about these plans of the World Bank, because they're absolutely some of the worst ideas I've ever heard.
When you say take away, what are they going to do with it once they take it away?
Give it to large farmers.
Oh my God.
I mean, there's people all over the Middle East and China and everywhere else that want to have more land. You know, they'll go in and grab it all. I mean, basically, what they're doing is fomenting land grabbing, or what they're wanting to do is foment land grabbing all over Africa.
Do you know of work that's being done in China to restore agricultural lands in China?
I don't, because I've spent very, very little time among farmers in China. I mean, I've been there several times to attend conferences, but I really haven't been out in the fields, so I can't say.
Because they're doing the land grabbing in large part.
Oh yeah, they're doing land grabbing all over Africa.
Excuse me for a moment. I'd like to show you a photograph that I took at the Chicago Midway Airport about 4 years ago. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Adam, would you send that around to people? That's horrible.
It's truly horrible.
Wow.
Yep, I'm happy to send it around if
that
you really want it.
I actually really do, because it helps me realize how bad the situation is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we could. Yeah.
Wow. This was how many years ago?
About 4 years ago.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I would really love that. I'll put it up. Yeah, it helps really focus me.
Okay.
Thank you.
I didn't see it, but anyway.
You didn't see it?
Yep.
Well, I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Although I would have liked to have seen your reaction.
It probably would have been like the others.
Clarice, I think somebody, Sial, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, chatted the 40% figure that you were thinking of maybe was that 40% of small farmers are women. Does that sound right, Roland?
No, it was 4% that I wrote down, not 40.
No, this is from Seal.
I made a mistake.
Well, no, I said that African smallholder farmers by themselves, not including smallholder farmers around the world, but African smallholder farmers could sequester about 4% of what the Paris Accords agreement were saying. Is that by the year 2100? Is that the figure you're thinking of?
No, just to clarify, this is Seal, and I just recently, we just recently went to a drawdown talk with Paul Hawkins, and I remember, because it stood out to me, he said that of the small farmers, which he had slightly different numbers than you guys, but of those, he said 40% were women, and that stood out to me.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. No, I take it back. It was 60%. I was wrong. It was 60%.
Women are the farmers in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In fact, I prefer working with women with green manures because they have more of a stake in getting them going, because they're the ones who say, at least in Africa, they're the ones who save all that weeding work, and they're the ones who save a lot of wood collecting work if they can just prune trees that are already growing in their fields. And women get a lot more benefits out of this than the men do. And
water
so,
carrying.
in fact, I always insist, if I'm working in a village, that at least some women be present at our meetings. I mean, I absolutely insist on that, because they're the ones that, even if the men aren't too interested, the women will be definitely interested.
Are there organizations working against this plan by the World Bank to grab up smallholder farms?
I don't know. I just read that recently, and as far as I know, it's still in the planning stage. But that's when it's best to let them know you don't agree with what they're doing. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I would think that Via Campesina might be.
I would assume Via Campesina, if they know about it yet. If they know about it yet, yes, they will be very strongly against it. Yeah, I worked with Via Campesina way back when it was just getting started. I mean, I'm the fellow who was probably most responsible for getting it going, Eric Holt Jimenez, is a good friend of mine. I would frankly, though, having said that, I would frankly trust if there's a discrepancy between the figures of the FAO and the figures of Via Campesina, I would give more credence to the FAO, frankly.
My.
Pardon? Hello?
Sorry, I meant to mute myself. I was talking to the cat.
Oh, okay.
I think the cats are concerned too. They've been going to a lot of these Zoom events.
This is true. She was talking to me, to us. So yeah.
Well, it sounds like we're basically sort of out of questions. Do any people have any comments?
I think this is great, Roland. I mean, I really enjoyed it and learning a lot, and it also reinforces my belief that people are the only hope. I mean, people as opposed to organizations, not organizations like Via Campesina or Bio for Climate or anybody else's organizations pulling in the right direction, but it's the blessed unrest that is the hope, because the current structure of world, call it governance, is hopeless, and I think the coronavirus has come along to help with some of that and to make us go local again. And it won't be enough, but it will be a start, a tragic start, but a start. Nature saying, listen up, and this is certainly doing it. A lot of people aren't listening, but there are many of us who are. So, and your work is a big part of that, a huge part of it.
Well, you know, I definitely do believe in you know, development taking into account all sorts of different things, you know, including, you know, working together, learning to work together as groups, and you know, all sorts of other things more than just cover crops. I mean, I've been very,
of course,
although right now, because of this crisis of the droughts in Africa, I mean, I'm afraid there are going to be millions of people dying within the next couple of years, each year, because these soils are getting so bad that life in the communities is ending. And so right now, I'm really not working in development. I'm working in disaster prevention, you might say. So we've restricted our activities to just dealing with green manures, basically. You know, I'm not comfortable with that in a sense, but in another sense, I think it's the only thing we can do when we're facing the possibility of millions and millions of people dying of starvation. But anyway, so I totally agree with a lot of things you were saying in the meeting before this. And I realize that we've sort of left a lot of that behind in order to deal with a very, very specific point of agricultural technology. But I in no way, you know, I didn't have any disagreement with what was being said during the earlier meeting.
Okay, and we will.
Wait. I just want to say to Roland that I very, very much appreciated your other book, 2 Years of Corn. And
oh, well, thank you.
I'm a longtime teacher, educator type, and it's really also given me ideas of how to think about educational change. So thank you.
Oh, well, great. Okay, good.